Welcome to another episode of the podcast. My name is Jason Scott Montoya, and I'm here with Addison Blue Williams. Addison is a comedy screenwriter, special operations combat veteran, a former professional gamer, musician, member of Mensa, entrepreneur, writer. What else?
By day, I'm a marketing strategist.
Well, we want to talk today about movie shapes. Movie shapes is a better way to find, review, and share movies you love or don't. I'm Jason Scott Montoya. I'm also a digital marketer, a freelancer, written a couple books on freelancing and small business, and also a lover of movies. And part of how me and Addison intersected was our love and value of movies, as well as our varying points of view on them. And so really we've been discussing movies ever since we met many years ago. And last year when we were discussing Endgame and the things we liked about it and the issues we had with it, I wrote some emails, you wrote some emails, and then you started to build a spreadsheet and I started to work on that spreadsheet, and then we workshopped that further, and all of a sudden movie shapes came out. So what do you recollect from that time? How did that come to be? Why did you decide to start a spreadsheet from our conversation?
I remember the pain point was thinking you'd make a fair point, and I'd read it and I'd say, okay, but I don't care about that part as much as you do. And so I thought, you know what, if I just list out for Jason the stuff I care about most, like I rank it and put the stuff I don't care about and I rank that, then Jason would say, okay, well, while I, Jason, care much about that, Addison does not. So it will not be helpful to point out to Addison, like, hey, it has great X, when Addison's mostly concerned about feature Y. And what's interesting is, since creating it, we've been mostly interested in learning what features we like more than we are about just summarizing a movie as a good or bad movie alone. So it's made the discussions much more interesting, I think. We can talk about any movie instead of just being like, oh, you hate it and I like it. We don't share anything. We can be like, we can say something new, like, oh, you like it and I don't. Does that match up with our preferences? Or do we have some sort of bias here? Are we wrong about ourselves? So
yeah, and so there's an aspect of us understanding who we are and understanding who someone else is, and then where we intersect in agreement and disagreement. But it's not so much that that when it's I think what I've learned is how subjective our qualitative assessment of movies is, and how much of it there perhaps are some maybe more objective elements we might find agreement on, but I think a lot of it, if it gets is hidden by the subjectivity that is driving those conversations. So just to give people listening an example of our difference. So your number one cross attribute in the movie shapes, and we're going to jump into the attributes later, but your top is dialogue clarity. So that is your most important factor in a movie. And mine is character depth. So if, and there are other factors too that we consider, but if you're just looking at through those two, obviously we're looking at the movie with completely different eyes in a way. And that's okay. We're not trying to say that one is better than the other, but it's rather to understand what it is I'm looking for and why I particularly like that thing I'm looking at. Right.
Yeah, I think even that's great, because right off the bat, we could just do this basic thought experiment. Could we imagine a movie where the dialogue is really clear, but the characters are really shallow?
Yeah.
Or a movie where the characters are really complex, but nothing they say makes any sense. Mm-hmm. And, that would be the test is, okay, well, how do Addison and Jason feel about those films?
Yeah. And the ability to create a language, the movie shapes language, that allows us to discuss these things and then to slice them apart and then to reassemble them. So it's like a deconstructive, constructive exercise. And we understand that it's not as clean as it might be in the variables that we've created, but though they act as a thinking exercise to at least evaluate them in a maybe a scientific way, if you would, or at a laboratory, so to speak.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it, the scientific way. We're trying to take something like aesthetic and turn it into a personality test, because even personalities, right? People have been doing psychoanalysis for 120 years or so. And even then, we're still coming up with better nomenclature. And a lot of art still gets to live in a very philosophical area, but we can be really practical here. We can talk nuts and bolts. Do you like what you see? Do you like what you hear? What do you care about? So
Yeah.
I think we're in phase one now, where we're actually just kind of penciling it in and handwriting all the answers.
Yeah.
But ultimately, we want to come up with like a really good personality test, like a Myers-Briggs level quality for movies.
Yeah, and really just being able to make it easy for people to use the framework, and then to be able to ultimately it's understand why I like movies and why I don't, to review them in that through that lens. But it's also a sharing mechanism. So through this exercise, I have more clarity on the types of movies you like, and vice versa. And so if I'm going to recommend a movie, I can recommend it through that lens, like, hey, I think you would like this movie for this reason or that reason based on your shape. Even though my shape is different and I didn't care for that movie as much, I think you would actually like it more than I did, or vice versa.
That's a great point. I think this actually reminds me of a Martin Scorsese comment from earlier this week. He had said that he was kind of bummed that people were thinking of movies strictly as content now, and that it was really an algorithm filling out things about like genre or spectacle and things like that. And what's great about our system is that it actually says, what if we went back to curation, right? Like where a person would still decide what is an objectively good movie, but then they could still match you with that curated film that's best for you. There's not enough time in the day to watch every good movie.
So for me, when I think about like general systems like IMDB or Rotten Tomatoes or even Netflix to a lesser degree, but when I think about the first two more, they say a movie is good or not, and you have the critics and the users, but there's a limitation in my mind. It feels like that's a reactive assessment of whether a movie is good, and it's too broad in its numbers. And I think what we're trying to do is say, who are you? And then create a system that sort of snipers into you and your preferences, as opposed to this generic thing that, the Rotten Tomatoes score, perhaps it's a variable to consider, and we don't necessarily we're not trying to replace that. But it's just so broad and generic that it's a difficult tool for people that love movies. Maybe for casual people, it's a better tool. Maybe that's the difference.
That's true. Because ultimately there are going to be some people who don't want to look under the hood this much. And in that way, a lot of this can eventually be automated, right? Like you click thumbs up on a Netflix movie, it's going to be like, I kind of bet you liked these elements. Thinking like Pandora Music, or when you're using Apple Music, it kind of starts to figure out what you like. The crazy thing is, a lot of movies, the way they've broken it down is based on only a very limited set of data, because they're using the things that they already know about movies, the cast. So for example, they're like, oh, people like Will Smith cop movies and fantasy movies. So they made, what's the fantasy? Bright. They made Bright, and it flopped. They're like, how could this happen? People who loved Lord of the Rings and Bad Boys didn't like Bright. Well, there's a little bit more to it than that. We love Lord of the Rings for different reasons than we love Bad Boys, and it will show up better in our
and another example, I recently watched The Rhythm Section, which is a kind of a spy thriller, which got brutal reviews on Rotten Tomatoes and elsewhere, but I liked it. And a lot of the reviews said it wasn't anything new. It wasn't novel. I mean, that's one of our attributes, is novelty. But I have a low novelty score, so I don't necessarily need a movie to be new or different. I just want it to be good in the sense of what I think is good. And I saw the performance, the character, and the visuals as the top three movie values, and then the top three audience preferences: believability, clarity, and impact. So, but it did, if you have a high novelty need, then you wouldn't have liked that movie. And so, that's an example of that playing out.
That's a good example. I watched a foreign film. It was okay. It was called Border. It's Swedish, and it is a fantasy thriller film. And it has to do some similarities to a project I'm working on, but it really didn't share almost any of my top attributes, just because it was mostly about setting and novelty. And novelty and setting are both very low attributes on mine. So while I was like, okay, I'm gonna get outside my comfort zone and appreciate what's good in this, it just didn't grab me. It didn't, put tears in my eyes or anything. The way I would expect other, films with more of the things I care about, like dialogue, clarity, and story, those kinds of things.
And I think we're tapping into something that I think does happen organically, which is friend referral, movie referrals from friends. So I think to some degree we tend to, have friends in circles that share certain of values. I think certain critics you might follow along either on Twitter or other places, and the movies they suggest, you're like, oh yeah, that's good. And there's something happening there, but it's organic. It's not formalized. And I think what we're trying to do is go, what's happening there, and could we sort of facilitate that in an intentional way versus it just being an accident for certain people that stumble upon it.
Yeah, to an extent, we're going to eliminate some of the arguments that are happening, because when people say certain things, a lot of times they're using a word that has multiple meanings, right? So that is the challenge. They'll say that movie has no depth, and it might actually have depth in 4 out of 7 categories. But that person was meaning depth in 3 specific areas. And, I don't want to take the wind out of the sails of people who love to argue about movies, but
because there's a difference between character depth, story depth, visual depth, like all of those. And that's what we're trying to account for, is those variants.
Yeah, because there will be somebody who saw the other spot where there was depth, and they'll be like, what are you talking about? Are you even watching the same movie? But the word depth really applies to a lot of different features. So
and the system allows us to kind of look at it at a high level and maybe just talk about depth. But then if you get that in that disagreement, then you can slice it in. And I think generally speaking, we can generally agree on the strengths or the top, the most worthwhile elements of a movie. I think we can have general agreement on those. When there is, it's usually a definition, like, well, how are you looking at it and within what layer? But that gives us a tool to actually work through that versus just both people just kind of being stuck. But I think like me and you would maybe look at a Zack Snyder type movie and go, visual is going to be a high priority element for his movies. That's sort of a trademark of his. And if depending on how the other factors tie in might determine whether or not that's something you want or not. But I think that's the point I'm trying to make. Even though we might evaluate the movie differently, we can generally agree that visual is one of the strong elements of it.
That's a great way of putting it. I've done some judging for, say, film festivals before, so I kind of used to breaking it down. But even there is this requirement that even if you don't like something for taste and you're a judge, you must actually be able to explain how something is critically broken, about why it, if I'm giving the sound a score less than, say, 5 out of 10, I need to be able to explain that, like, hey, I could hear static or like background noise from the person carrying the mic. Otherwise, it's still just a matter of taste. There's really a floor for taste. And then after that, it is production value. So what I mean by that is there are going to be some movies that are universally bad, no matter what what form your preferences take. There are still going to be movies that you agree are generally worse or generally better, even with somebody with completely different preferences, right? So for the most part, I'm not trying to make everybody angry, but there are just going to be classic films that more people are going to relate to, even if they're just completely different viewers. right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So, and there is one of the variables is relevance, and investment is another. And there are some of the variables they shift. There's an aspect of it that's not as objective or evergreen as some of the other variables. So movies, our relationship with the movie could actually change because of some of those variables over time as well.
that's a good point. The people's relationship with what's the actor from House of Cards?
Oh, Kevin Spacey.
Yeah, Kevin Spacey. It's going to be a lot harder to watch something like American Beauty now, where you're like, oh, he, did have real predatorial behavior. So now that movie takes on a completely new tone.
Yeah. So that, and I don't know if what variable specifically, but yeah, that relevant factor changes
relevance
things.
And investment, because people are going to be negatively invested in the film, especially because a theme of the film is that there is someone suspicious that he is, preying on someone.
Yeah. And someone who watches that movie in 100 years doesn't have the visceral experience of that scandal unfolding. And so they're going to watch it differently than we would because we were here when it happened. Right.
Yep. And people who watched it when it came out and had no idea, they saw it differently as well. So it's going to be interesting to see some of those subjective ones change over time. And also to see what's happening now to canonical films. I've seen some people start to say that they're not very into Jaws, but a big chunk of that is that a lot of the things that are in Jaws that are really great were great because of novelty. But if you saw all the movies that knocked off, that stole from Jaws, if you saw those first because you're that young, then Jaws looks like the derivative film. So novelty, if that matters to you, it's going to affect the order that you watch movies in your life.
Whereas if you cared about the characters, I would say Jaws is probably a high character film in terms of attribute. That doesn't go away with time or even in order of watching it.
Character stays, but novelty is going to completely depend the order in which you've watched films.
Yeah. So there's a character depth there that you could get. And I think that's one of the challenges too, is like when I think about all the movies I have not seen, and me and you both have a lot of kids. You have 4 and I have 5. So, and we both, do a lot of great work. So we're limited in how much time we can just sit and watch movies. So we have to pick, like every pick is like life and death, this is 2 hours. If I get to waste it, or is it going to be worthwhile? And so knowing that, like, we have to be more selective than perhaps our more abundant time selves in our past. So how do we do that? And how do we do that for ourselves and for others? And within that limitation is the opportunity here with Movie Shapes.
Exactly. That's economical watching.
Yeah.
And I totally understand the idea that people want to kind of, they understand that they're still a work in progress too, that their shape is going to change. So what's cool is that the stage that it's in now, do you mind if I start talking about a little bit of the process?
Yeah.
So the way it works now is we're in the actual like really gritty details. In fact, if you want to pull up the screen, we could look at the sheet.
Yeah. So the actual prototype or the website?
Or you could go down on the this is the site for the Movie Shape site where you can walk through how we got here and what this takes. If you get down to the spreadsheet part, I think it's just below that. Oh, I see.
Well, we have the elements, but I'll just switch over to the sheet here. Yeah.
We've started at the stage where we look as deeply and graphically as possible. And the reason is because we want to be really scientific at the beginning. And this is really, it's a passion project, but the goal is to make sure that we get this calibrated now, and that our early adopters are using this similarly to how we are. So there's kind of a cool common language. So the type of person who this is going to interest now is somebody who knows that they know a lot of movies. They're interested in figuring out what they like and don't like about movies. They have strong opinions. That would make you a better candidate. If you watch a lot of movies and you say after every movie, I love every movie, then cool, we could work with you, but your shape is going to be really, it's going to be a perfect circle, really.
Yeah.
And
versus a distinct one. And you know, we may even find that there are patterns as more people start to use it, like there's almost like categorical patterns among groups of people, and you find your story groups and your character groups and your audio groups, and also combos like a story dialogue group, which would be you, right? So so that's an interesting dynamic that could also unfold, but to enough people fill it out and we get to see those patterns, which is
right. So we're doing this the handheld way. It's almost pencil and paper. It's really Google Docs, but it is just going to be coming in and being self-reflective and saying, you know, how much do I care about dialogue? How much do I care about character? How much do I care about story? And we get it. These things don't perfectly separate from each other, right? Good characters help make a story better. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to be able to make some gut distinctions. And I'll even give a hint about how I filled it out. I don't know if this was how you did, Jason, but what I would do is I opened up a document and I wrote down all my favorite moments in movies.
Yeah.
And I said, what was happening then? And in fact, I went on to YouTube and watched a lot of them over and was like, oh, is it really good audio? Is it really clear? Is it really great visuals? What's going on here? And I rated it accordingly. And if there was something that consistently didn't pop up in my favorite clips, I just put a lower rating, a lower number.
So not just favorite movies, but favorite movie moments is what you're saying.
I did. I went to the exact moments. So I went to like Lord of the Rings, the fight in front of Gondor, all the way from the beginning to like I am no man, and she cuts off the Witch King's head. Or in Return of the Jedi, where Luke goes with Darth Vader on Endor, you know, in the elevator all the way until he beats him, chops off Darth Vader's hand, and then still says I quit. That kind of stuff for me was revealing, because I said, oh my gosh, they have a lot of similar traits, and they don't have they also lack some of the same things, but I didn't care. And then when we had to refine our list, my list came out where I said I liked too many things. It wasn't distinct enough. I think I thought of myself as too positive. When I had to go back and take some of the points off, I actually went and thought, what are the biggest disappointing moments in movies, and what was working and what wasn't working in those. I flipped them. So
those are some good tips.
I don't want to dog on somebody's favorite movies.
Well, I think it's I mean, it allows for for example, I think when you talk about clarity and depth, I think sometimes when you go one direction, you can lose the other, just from a practical creation standpoint. Novelty and investment probably have a little bit of a similar dynamic there. So the point being is that as a creator, we have to make decisions, and sometimes there's trade-offs in those decisions. And perhaps there are some that are skilled enough to be able to do them both, but it does seem like if you there's a trade-off. Now, I think a universally great movie would be one where they are strong in a lot of the areas, and that we have a hard time figuring out which ones are the most worthwhile, because it's strong in multiple areas beyond just the top ones. So, and so in other words, when we evaluate a movie, saying what the top ones are isn't to necessarily say that the non-top ones are bad. It's just that they maybe not as good, although in some cases they could be bad as well. So
that's fair enough. And you bring up a good point, because there are some where the strengths are so strong that the weaknesses are overlooked. So that's the cool thing about a really good shape, is if it matches up perfectly, you'll feel like it's a 100% film, even if it's a 90% quality film. You forgive the 10% that's lacking, because you matched up, you synced up.
Yeah, and I do think that when it's lacking in the things that we care about, we tend to, from a lot of the critical reviews I've seen, uh, critics tend to nitpick things that are actually irrelevant to what it is that upsets them. It's almost like they don't know where to direct their wrath, so they just nitpick things that almost seem like silly, if that makes sense.
That's a great point. I've been reading a lot of television and film reviews, because I like to keep up with what's popular and why.
Yeah,
Not just from an analytical standpoint like we're using, but I just want to see socially what are people liking.
yeah,
Um, and you're right, a lot of the headlines now will single out something that really doesn't have enough volume to occupy the whole article. It'll be
yeah,
like such and such a film falls flat because of its lead, and then you open up and they're like, oh, the lead has this one really dumb line, and you're like,
yeah,
that to you was falling flat. But if that really destroys character or dialogue for them, or it was really a ding on investment or believability, and that was like just all they cared about, then yeah, a lot of the rest of it is them trying to justify
yeah,
uh, that one thing they cared about.
yeah,
They're coming up with all these other reasons that are really inferior reasons, when really they should be writing a whole thing about, here's why I care about the believability of the line.
yeah,
Right.
yeah. And their and our relationship to it affects that as well. And in terms of properties that are larger than just a single movie. So let's jump into the specific elements. So with movie shapes, we have a collection of values, movie values, character, story, setting, dialogue, performance, visual, audio. So those are what we consider the fundamentals of a movie, or it could be a television show, but a visual medium. Those are the fundamentals of the movie values. And we do understand that, we could split off audio into sound and music, or, the performance, is there's different types of performances and visuals. There's the special effects and the visual. Like, we understand there's a lot of layers to this, but we wanted to get the core values that encompass them all, and be distinguished enough that they are different than each other versus overlapping. And there still is some overlap. But those are the movie values. And then we have the second set, which is what we call the audience attributes, which is relevance. And we're going to dive into the definitions of these, but relevance, novelty, clarity, impact, believability, depth, and investment. So those shape, those are in a lot of ways are us. The first is about the movie and the second is about us. And the idea of the shape is to intersect us with the movie in a way that creates a helpful visualization. And
if people saw the graveyard of all the attributes we said we had to throw out, they'd say, okay, I get it. You guys put a lot.
Yeah, we had to combine and consolidate and relabel and even probably continue to wrestle with these. And so when it comes to the movie shapes, there's 7, and then there's 7 audience attributes. So that worked out real nicely for us. But with the movie values, the 7, there's two groups of the 7. The first is what I would consider the story elements, which would be universal to any story, regardless of medium. So that's the character. That includes the character, their development, their being, the story. This includes the conflict, experiences, and story resolution. The setting. This includes the context of the story and characters, genre of the film, and other related elements. And there is an interesting, tension between story and setting, like what is story and what is setting. There is an overlay there that can be debated. And then we've got dialogue, the written lines of dialogue actually spoken, not how they are performed. Now I want to kind of lean into dialogue. So that's something I didn't have, that you added specifically, you fought for. And it also happens to be one of your top values. So why is that its own distinct thing? And why did you fight for that?
Well, that's a great question. Essentially, with dialogue, it's the best way to talk about what is actually going on in the story and the characters. So if we had a film that is no dialogue, no spoken lines, then yes, we can still get something through the visual medium on character, story, setting. There are great films with no dialogue, but when people actually express their inner thoughts, right, they're actually saying things, it's going to change a lot. And I think that it's the most human part of it. Especially, I come from a screenwriting background, so when you're writing the script, the only thing that makes it into the final cut of the movie from the script is the dialogue. Everything else is performative, right? Nobody's going to read off the action or scene slugs, but the dialogue is going to make it through. So it is the best interpretation of what's really intended to come out, I think. That I have a bias, obviously, and you called it out.
Well, and I think the thing that resonated with me was that you said when the dialogue is at its best, is in a way it's its own character. It stands outside of the character. It resonates out. It's a line we use in daily life. It transcends the film itself in a way, in the sense that there are lines we both say or other people say that we actually don't even know who the character was, or maybe even the movie in some cases, but we say the line, right?
That's true. I have a lot of family members who will say a famous quote, and I'll say, "Do you know who that's from?" And they'll say, "No," but the line really does resonate with me. I get the point of it. So that is my. I think what is it? Come with me if you want to live. A lot of people know that from Terminator 2, but don't know the Terminator 1, reference. A lot of people say, "Get in the chopper." So I've been just Arnold Schwarzenegger quotes, but a lot of people haven't seen 80s action films, so they don't know what they're from. And it's funny that it carries that pop culture resonance. So dialogue, it does carry that extra weight. Thanks for reminding me of that.
Yeah. So then we also have performance, visual, and audio, and these would be unique to movies. The performance would be the acting, the interactions unique to the performance. The visual, this attribute includes how the story, characters, and setting are visually represented or presented on the screen. The framing, the angles, the any visualizations that, special effects, visual effects, all that.
Let me do a quick note. So obviously you see performances, but visual needs to be about like visual acuity, angles of shots, production value. But what the human beings do, just imagine that not counting towards visual. By the same token, audio, if there's a really lame line of dialogue, but boy, is it recorded really well over an amazing soundtrack, and you heard it with perfect audio clarity, then audio gets a high score, right? So imagine that they're all just speaking a foreign language. That's how you rate audio.
Yeah. So, or as in many Christopher Nolan movies, you can't even hear what they're saying.
I didn't even want to say it, but I was thinking of the garbled Batman voice. What do you want to kill me?
Oh yeah. So that's obviously a different style, and some people are gonna like it, some aren't. But the audio would include the sound and the music effects, and I think also, I think there is a dance between the audio and the visual in terms of the timing of the audio. If the audio was off sync, I think that would be obviously something's wrong. So there's an interesting interaction between those two dynamics.
A movie with subtitles, you're going to rate the dialogue differently than if you're a native speaker. We know that's going to happen. Just the same way that you might rate dialogue lower if the performance was also pretty crummy, even if it's a really good line. So
So let's we'll run through the second set of the audience attributes next. But before we do, let's kind of sit on these values, these movie values from the movie shapes for a moment. When you think about character, story, setting, dialogue, performance, visual, audio, what are some movies, and we don't have to do it in order, but just, when you look at one of these, what movies come to mind for you? I mentioned earlier that the rhythm section had high performance. Particularly like Blake Lively's character, resonated. I think when you think of The Dark Knight, you think of Heath Ledger's performance. So what are some that come to mind for you? We mentioned Zack Snyder for visual. You might put Michael Bay in the visual group as well. Any of his movies.
What I'll do is, to make it kind of universal, I'm gonna pick some that have plenty of awards to shore up my assertions. So I could pick some deep cut films, and people might say, "Oh, that's edgy," but I don't want to mess up the calibration. I really want people to say, "Okay, I agree with that."
Yeah.
So, for example, Silence of the Lambs is going to get a high dialogue rating, right?
Got
like,
it.
had really
Interactions between her, Clarice, and him, kind of
and,
that.
and yeah, Hannibal Lecter. People still quote Silence of the Lambs, and when you watch it, it's very poignant in the dialogue, and it was Best Picture winner, right?
Yeah.
So there was something to how it was said.
Yeah, I'll throw it's a TV show, but I'll throw Cobra Kai in the dialogue bucket.
I love, that might explain why I love Cobra Kai so much. Dialogue,
I
but
mean, the dialogue is so iconic in such a great way for me. So,
and I've heard a lot of criticisms of the performances, and what's funny is performance ranked low for me. So I'm thinking, yep, I am the most forgiving
of the performance. Yeah.
Yeah.
But see, I mean, I like the dialogue so much in Cobra Kai, I wanted to rewatch it and just write all the lines I love down.
That's fantastic.
So,
I will. I probably will watch that again. I'm thinking about writing a spec script to that. So, but if we think about setting, a great example would be Lord of the Rings. People now associate New Zealand ubiquitously because the setting is so beautiful. It's so perfectly done. People purchase set items, like we I have a Lord of the Rings tattoo. Right, like so the setting was just crystal clear. And if we think about performance, I mean, we would want to look at something where multiple actors won awards from the same movie. So Godfather would be a great example. Where people said Godfather 2, right? There was just great performances from multiple actors. I'm going out of sequence. Do you have any that you think of for like character story?
One that comes to mind for story would be Mad Max Fury Road.
Yep,
I just
that's
love,
a great one.
Yeah, I just love the story structure, and it's and the clarity it is a very clarity oriented type of story. So that if I want to go into a subset, character wise, there's a lot of different ones to pick from.
I might do something that was a little bit weirder.
I mean, I'll throw the X-Men movies in several, but probably all of them in a way, because those characters move through them, but you really care. At least the main characters, you get to know them and you care about them. First Class,
X2,
Apocalypse, even the ones that aren't as good.
Oh, yeah, I see what you're saying. Everybody has a very clear and distinct personality. I was going to say X2 is the one that was most critically acclaimed. I think it did the best at the box office, perhaps, per budget. But X2, very character-driven story, right? We know exactly who is who and what do they want. So that's good.
Yeah, and I'll even throw, there's a movie that's Alien Resurrection. Had a lot of problems, and a lot of people rated it low, but the characters in that, they're great, and the way they interact with each other and who they are, and so that's, for me, that's an example of I can be more forgiving of those failures, because if I enjoy the characters or they have depth, that's something that works for me. So
yeah, memorable, colorful ensemble characters like Infinity War and things like that. So all right. And then for visual, I'd like to think of movies where I do think that a lot of them were empty, but I think a lot of people think of Avatar, James Cameron, for visual, because they're like, it looked so real for such a CG film. Even if they're like, man, that story is Dances with Wolves, and that setting is, mostly dependent on the quality of the visuals to make us really interested. And I don't have a lot of dialogue lines I remember from the movie, but boy, do I remember the visuals from Avatar. And I think the box office take from that speaks to the quality of the visuals.
Yeah, the high visual. And I guess for Avatar, I'd be curious. The characters, there are a few characters that are interesting and worthwhile. But I think when I think of Avatar, I think more of the story than I do the characters.
And And I just
But
think of it.
but I think the setting, I would almost say maybe the setting transcends the story and the characters for Avatar. That's more memorable or worthwhile than the other two.
I agree, and I would revisit the world even if they had completely new characters. So if they were
Yeah.
like, "Yeah, we're gonna make a new Avatar movie. It has nothing to do with the last one," I'd be like, "Okay, well, if it's gonna
Yeah.
be in the same setting, I'm interested."
Yeah. So, and that might be, is that a similar dynamic with like James Bond or Mission Impossible? Like you're rejoining those characters in that
Yeah,
way?
but that gets a little bit into the viewer attributes.
Yeah.
I was thinking more Star Wars. Now that they've realized we don't have to tell Skywalker stories anymore, the setting is what matters in The Mandalorian, for example. And yeah,
Yeah.
they do pull back some characters, so they're definitely doing that. But the
Yeah.
first season of The Mandalorian is mostly just
Yeah.
revisiting.
But I would for story, then I would put Lord of the Rings. I mean, the characters are a big part of that, but there is this overarching epic that is driving the whole thing. The characters, I don't know. I guess it feels more story driven than character driven in the overarching sense.
That is interesting because it's tough. That's one of those ones where it's going to be like, okay, one is a 9 out of 10 and the other's a 10 out of 10.
Yeah, yeah,
Have them compete.
yeah.
But when I think of audio, I think of actually surprisingly, I think of movies where we wouldn't think about it as much, but like Indiana Jones, the Raiders of the Lost Ark, like we immediately know the music, the John Williams score for the dun, 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 and the whip crack, and just the great sound effects and stuff like that. The plane taking off, it was the rumbling rocks, all that stuff. Like it's so rich. That's an audio movie. All the way.
Yeah. And I think you got different types of audio. Again, Lord of the Rings would be another one put in there. I do think rewatching the X-Men movies recently, the movie that had the strongest audio was The Dark Phoenix. There was this sound that went with it. I think most of the Christopher Nolan movies tend to have a strong, I mean, Tenet and Dunkirk and all of them, like Dark Knight Rises. I mean, there's this Inception, this sound or this music that just, it kind of gets into you in a way that that sets it apart.
The thing so we're getting into that trouble where we had to merge stuff together because they are very deep on soundtrack and sound effect, but audio quality for the actual performance capture for the dialogue was in most Nolan films pretty lacking.
Yeah, because it depends on how you're looking at it, whether which layer, audio clarity versus audio, one of the other variables.
So anything that you wanted to add on the movie attributes?
Yeah, I think the idea is just to kind of understand what these are. We gave a few examples of each, but ultimately, as a movie viewer, you have to figure out which is more important. For me, I guess we can just kind of quickly look at ourselves. For me, my top three, my top one is character, and then story, and then performance. Those would be my top three as a generic value, between these options. My lowest would be setting.
Okay, we both had a lowest setting. I was also high. I was high. In my top three in this order were dialogue, story, character. And the funny telling thing about that is those are the three pieces that really you could pull out of a movie and have in a book, right? The dialogue, the story, and the character are going to live in a book too. So it's kind of revealing that, hey, maybe I'm more drawn to really good adaptations, or maybe I just had been raised so much with books over visual media that I have a bias.
Yeah, although one thing that we both have on our top 7 cross attributes. So when you take a movie value and attribute and you overlay them, we'll dive into that. But we both have audio impact in our top 7. Yep. And so so I was surprised by that, that was as high for me as it ended up being. Because it's number 4 for me and number 7 for you.
If a really perfect, the bit of music welling up at a very emotional moment of a film,
Yeah.
It's gonna get me. I think
Yeah.
about in Guardians of the Galaxy when Peter Quill grabs the Infinity Stone,
Yeah.
and then the whole soundtrack instantly changes. Um, that's really emotional, and that's just audio impact, right? It's not this amazing song that we think of and like hum the melody. So it's not just audio quality, and it's right. So we could say like I'm not invested in it. It's not familiar. It's not pop culture. So a great thing about Guardians of the Galaxy, it's a movie filled with pop songs, high relevance, high investment,
Yeah.
but the most poignant moment of the film doesn't have a pop song for me. It
Yeah.
just has really clear, impactful music right at this critical point. So I think that's a great example.
Yeah. Cool. Well, let's jump to the audience attributes. So now we have 7. They're all bundled together in one group. So we got relevance, which is the degree to which the attribute is relevant to me, my interests, my current context, my past journey, and my future aspirations. Novelty, the degree of importance that the attribute is novel or uniquely presented in the particular attribute. It's different than what I've come to expect. The degree of importance, the elements, themes are uniform, self-contained, and unambiguous is clarity. Impact, preference on the degree to which the movie has an intellectual, emotional, and physiological effect on me. Believability, the degree of importance that the movie's attribute is believable, and where it's not, it effectively suspends my disbelief. Depth, the degree of importance this attribute is deep, interconnected, and not easily labeled or simply explained, complex. Investment, the degree of importance to which you get a return on your investment while watching or rewatching it. By paying attention to the details, is there a reward? By rewatching, do these elements enrichen the experience? Is there ambiguity for me to own the interpretation as opposed to being explicitly told? That investment could be external or internal, I would add, in terms of going into it with an investment versus the investment of the film itself, of the experience of watching it itself. So these would be the 7 audience attributes that we've defined that determine why we like a movie or why we don't, or why, and these would be, later we'll cross these with the other ones. So you have character clarity, character depth, character believability, or performance novelty, performance impact, or audio relevance, or visual investment, whatever those cross attributes would be. But these are the 7 audience attributes. Anything you want to add to these?
So this one's harder because these are the things where these only exist because we have to be more specific about what's in a movie.
Yeah.
These don't make sense if we don't have the movie attributes. So the cool thing about them, if we want to talk about how these work, is that the best place to start to understand these is to look at a movie that scores high in most of its movie elements for one of these things, right? And sometimes it's good to actually look at movies that aren't so popular so that you can see an outlier. An outlier would be great.
Yeah.
So a good example is my brother. He loves movies that have tons of depth, even if they're very confusing.
Yeah.
So he loves, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind or Donnie Darko, right?
Yeah.
Weird movies are more likely to be deep.
Yeah.
Not because they're like emotionally, intellectually deep, but just that there's a lot of stuff happening and there's a lot of things to try to churn through, just a whole material to chew on.
Yeah, and I would agree with or share that sentiment with him. And I would say, I actually, before we did the movie shapes, I thought that I liked novelty because a lot of the movies that tend to have that depth are novel, but it wasn't actually the novelty that I liked, it was the depth. And so that was an interesting recognition when I realized the difference.
That's a great thing to mention. So we had talked about how sometimes depth can compromise clarity, but we could also talk about how, for example, depth and novelty, they often come together, right? Because the more new stuff I throw in, the more total stuff there's going to be. Just like clarity can help believability. The more, I think a great example is Star Trek. Star Trek, a very classic Star Trek. if there was something that they knew was going to bother the audience, they would quickly explain it clearly.
Yeah. Oh,
Even
okay.
if it wasn't scientifically perfect, they just say like, these are the rules of this piece of the
Yeah.
science, and it increased the believability. Clarity
Yeah.
and believability go hand in hand.
Yeah.
You can't-
Although there are also times, I think you mentioned this one after we watched Tenet, where there were some things they clarified that actually made it less believable.
yeah, and I think that was conspicuous to me because I was watching Tenet we were doing the movie shapes stuff
Yeah.
for it. And when I realized that believability was coming in low, I realized that some of it wasn't at the cost of clarity, but that they were explaining things. They were adding clarity that was muddling the believability.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if you give an answer, a science answer in a film, and it creates new problems, then you've increased the depth, increased the clarity, decreased the believability all at once. And if the invented answer is really new, like in Tenet, you've increased depth, clarity, and novelty while crushing believability.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the idea is with some of these values, particularly I'll pick relevance. The movie may be relevant to me, but nobody else. So that from just a marketable standpoint, that's a challenge for making money. But if it's highly relevant to a large amount of people, then you're going to have a higher relevance score across the group. And so there's also an aspect of this when it comes to the difference between the individual and the group, in identifying perhaps segments or subsegments that that find it relevant, but also whether or not that's a popular film might be determined by some of those factors as well.
Yeah, so you bring up a point that like a sequel film, a really good sequel film can have higher relevance. It can have higher impact because now you have an emotional attachment, and you can have higher investment, right? Because it's going to weave with other films. It can. Some sequels don't do a good job.
Like someone watching Endgame after watching all the other movies can now have a higher return on the investment of that experience than if they just watched Endgame without ever watching anything before it.
So a good example of how that works would be if you already like superhero movies, it's already relevant, even if you haven't watched the other ones.
Yeah. Assuming you like superhero movies.
Right. But if you don't like superhero movies in general, but you've seen all the Marvel films, it's lower relevance score to you, but it's going to have a higher investment score.
Yeah.
And then the next thing is a lot of times those ones going up, relevance, impact, and investment, can lower novelty because familiarity is often the thing that makes us like those things more, right? By the 7th Harry Potter book, there's a formula, or I should say the 7th and 8th Harry Potter films, there's a formula.
Yeah.
And that formula is going to lower novelty. It does by design, but man, those other traits go up. So sometimes there's a cost benefit.
And so if you want a character, and that's where you could also slice and dice and go, well, perhaps you create the familiarity in the setting and then you change up the characters or you change up the story. There's ways to sort of allow for some variety without being sacrificing entirely one particular area as a creator, at least.
Yep.
So I guess what are some movies that kind of jump into these buckets? When I think of impact, the impact can be different angles. So it could scare you. It could make you cry. It could make you scream. It could make you laugh. Right. But like when I thought about like, what are the highest impact movies that I could think of, that were more on the tension side of things. So I thought Uncut Gems, like that movie had such high impact. It was, and I love impact. It was almost unbearable.
It was fatiguing.
But I kind of liked that. But then it was like, you're taking me even beyond my comfort. Or Gravity or The Revenant. Like those are similar ones where it's just this onslaught. The movie never lets you go. And I love that experience. But yeah, it's wearisome to watch a movie like that.
You just reminded me of, if I think about impact, I think about The Prestige.
Yeah.
Where there are so many things, like there are things I see, there are things I hear, there are characters and story elements, visuals, and also just so many things that happen in there where I'm like, oh, it got me so hard right there. So
Yeah.
lines of dialogue where you're like, oh,
And the culmination of it, where it, like, there could be, momentary, like the conclusion of Prestige is like a high impact moment. And I recently watched Casino Royale, and I'd forgotten what happened the first time I watched it. So when I rewatched it, I was impacted all over again in the third act by this surprise that I didn't see coming.
That's a good example. Casino Royale was a big impact one, and that's why it broke the genre, right? Like, people were not expecting to have an emotional reaction to a James Bond film.
Yeah.
They were expecting high relevance, low clarity, and just a whole lot of relevance and investment, right? Like, they're super into the IP. They're going to see novelty. There's going to be some new areas, for setting. There's going to be some new story, but ultimately the same characters. And so that's a good example.
Yeah. And I guess just to pause a moment here to step back before we do more movies. For me, my number one is impact. My number two is depth, and number three is clarity. So impact, depth, clarity would be my top three. And then my last is novelty. That's my lowest.
That's funny because we do have the same top three, not in the same order. I'm clarity, impact, depth. But the next thing is my lowest one is investment.
Yeah.
I can see something that's like completely new to me. I guess the best example is sometimes I'll walk in on my kids' movies, and if what's happening is super clear, out of context, but what's happening emotionally
in the moment of the movie,
is really clear and impactful and deep, then I will be sucked in with no other context.
Yeah.
So my investment's super low, but as long as the people are, sometimes it's as simple as like, this person's like, I'm saying this is my emotional journey of the film, and I'm immediately like, I don't even have to see the rest of the film.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of the Pixar movies are like that. Kids put it on, all of a sudden I'm watching it with them.
The kids, well, that's true. A good example is I was talking before we had the podcast about the movie Onward, and despite a lot of, it has some pretty distinct flaws. The emotional journey of the film is stated outright. There's the moment where the Tom Holland character literally starts checking off a list of, here's the emotional journey of the film, and it shows you the list and then the moments in the film where that happened. And if I come into the movie at like that point, I'm basically taking the whole journey in that very clear and impactful.
Yeah. And it was a high impact moment. Yeah. So, so that's interesting. But I think with investment, that would be I guess so. Novelty is my lowest, and then that's my second lowest. But when I look at it more specifically, I have a higher investment for story and character, but I have a lower investment for the other, visual, audio, performance, dialogue.
It's imbalanced.
Yeah.
Yeah. I shouldn't say imbalanced. It's not. So I actually like more novelty in the performance in audio than I do in my characters and story. Interesting, because I like almost every John Williams soundtrack, even if it's the same instruments and the novelty on the audio.
Oh, okay, yeah. So, and for impact, see, I have the setting can have a low impact, but my highest is character impact, and then dialogue and performance impact would be after that. So, like a good dialogue impact for me, a line that just hits me in a way that does its job is good. So like the scene in Rocky Balboa where he's talking to his son and he gives that monologue, it's like he was talking to me, so. Oh
yeah, I absolutely understand that. I get that also from books, and I think that's why that's dialogue impact. That is my number 2 and your number 5, so I think we both have that. Like if it feels like they're talking through the screen to you, then it's good. It's gonna immediately, I'm gonna resonate with it. Sometimes I almost get mad that they can succeed with it. I'm thinking like, you're cheating, but it still worked.
Yeah. Now relevance, even though it's lower for me, it's in the middle, I guess. But the aspect of relevance I care most is character relevance. So I want to relate to the character, whereas visual and audio relevance is lower. So
I see that in you personally, that if it's not character relevance, then you're not
Yeah.
asking more than they can do.
Yeah. So what are some other movies in this the buckets here? For clarity, the thing, I guess a movie that comes to mind is A New Hope. I feel like that's a very good example. Just the
And
characters, the
something that
story,
worked for them
even
is,
across the board of variables.
yes, something that worked really well for them was that George Lucas, people have joked about how on the nose the dialogue could be at times. But what's great is that some of the sci-fi elements, by having classically trained actors like Sir Alec Guinness in the film, they're going to ask you to make it a little less heavy on the sci-fi world building, but you can add clarity that way.
Yeah.
So what's cool is a lot of what people thought was novelty in Star Wars wasn't. It had come from things like, was it Flash Gordon and things like that?
Okay. Yeah.
But people didn't know that it wasn't novel. So the assembly of the parts was new to them. And it was crystal clear what was happening. So the average person could appreciate it.
Yeah. And I think, that's, it's, there's a lot going on there. Cause you have a lot of high novelty as well. But that novelty, if you watch New Hope now and you've watched everything else, if you're new to A New Hope, the novelty kind of is not there anymore. So it's an interesting dynamic that's changed, as an example.
But the clarity is high enough that my daughter, she's 4, and when we watch Star Wars together, she can tell me exactly what's happening in the film. In fact, sometimes it's so clear that I'm clouded by all my pop culture judgments about Star Wars now. I've talked about Star Wars more than I've watched it now. But she says things like, we watched Return of the Jedi, and she said, "Oh, Darth Vader doesn't want to kill Luke Skywalker." And I was like, "Yeah, but this is a scene where he's seeming like he wants to." And she's like, she's 4 and she's still like, "No, I feel like he's holding back." And I'm like, "You're 4, but it's super clear to your untrained eye that if Darth Vader really wanted to kill Luke Skywalker, he'd be all in it."
Another one would be Back to the Future, the first one.
Yeah, the first one. I was gonna say it gets a little crazy, but
the second one's a lot lower on clarity, I would say. But the first one for sure.
1.21 gigawatts, 88 miles an hour when the clock strikes exactly this time. The repetition is something that really helps clarity. So you bring up something. Back to the Future uses repetition, right? They say we have to be going this fast at exactly this time, and they beat that over the head. They say the characters' names over and over. There'll be, because there's a past version and a present version of each character, so they'll look right at somebody and be like, "Biff, Biff, Biff."
Yeah.
So like, okay, this guy's Biff.
The first in Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark be another one that comes to mind for clarity.
Yeah, and sometimes it can mess up believability, because sometimes people will be like, "Wait a second, the villain's just going to state their entire plan out loud for everybody," and that can crush believability. But I do like those moments where they're like, Raiders of the Lost Ark overcomes that by having villains who think they've already won. So if they do think they've already won, their statement of the plan is not that much of a sacrifice. Whereas there are other movies where the villain, they really shouldn't, and it turns into tropes. So if you want to talk about bad cliches and where that hurts a movie, that would be, it's going to lower the believability, it's going to lower the novelty, right? If you value novelty and you see a cliche, that's going to be bad, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. A movie that comes to mind for novelty would be Logan, and when you compare it against other films in that genre. I guess if in terms of superhero films, it's got although there is, when you look at the second half, there is a little bit more familiarity, but I would say the first half of it specifically is maybe got a higher novelty.
Right, because they went for rated R because Deadpool had succeeded, but Deadpool was funny and Logan's not funny.
Yeah, it's but it's also a high impact movie. Another example, high impact, that's kind of along the lines of Logan is the end of Ender's Game. I never read the book, so when the ending happened, it was like it was like a gut punch for me. So
yeah, a part of you dies when you get to the end of Ender's Game in the movie or the book. I think everybody should have to get to the end of Ender's Game organically no spoilers, and realize, because even though somebody told me like, oh man, it's gonna get you, when I read it, I was like, oh, I thought I knew what was gonna get me, and I didn't. So
Believability, I don't know. Saving Private Ryan would probably be one that sticks out.
That's a great example. Man, I think you picked maybe one of the best ones. There are some where the believability is high and it contradicts reality, and we have to now grapple with high believability films that are not factual.
Yeah.
So
that's so believable that it even though it's not. Yeah.
I guess, what was it? I got to think of one that's extremely believable but not factual. So I'm trying to think of maybe biographical films, or I was going to say, you know, what's funny is I think
like Fargo. That's a good one because it's based on a true story, but it's not a true story.
Yeah, it very quickly allows itself to deviate into completely fictional territory. So Fargo's the best example. I think you chose spot on.
Yeah. Ford versus Ferrari, that would probably be a high of believability.
Yeah, I think that works. I think what's funny is that sometimes what makes believability go up is dependent on the genre. If something claims to be based on a true story, the believability goes up the more normal people act. But in a fictional film, the believability goes up the more crazy they act.
Well, and here's a good. So I've seen the old, or the unbelievable Fantastic Fours. They're very kind of cartoony, but then they did the new one, and that's very grounded and more believable. So there's a distinct difference between the two films, but the newer one is definitely a different level of believability. So
right, that's a challenge, is the groundedness of a film. I have to think outside my own box, because dialogue believability is the only one in my top 7 for believability, but believability is still my fourth highest attribute. It is right there in the middle, right? Make me suspend my disbelief. But the groundedness of a movie is interesting, because if I watch the movie 300, there are sort of like bizarro physics to the world, but they're still bound. They still die at the end of the movie. Spoiler alert.
And you could have character believability, but then the setting or the story's not, right?
Yeah, right. The moon in 300 is 800 times the size of the sun in our sky, because it takes up the entire landscape. But it's beautiful, right? So it's very novel, it's very clear, it's very deep, and you're like, oh, what rich visuals, right? So it's great. Believability there is low, but the characters stay and they die. It's very grounded in that way.
Okay, so depth. What are some movies that come to mind for that?
Well, I named those ones earlier, like those sort of yuppie, I don't know, indie sci-fi films from the 2000s. So
I was thinking Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade comes to mind as one.
You do have to know a little bit more of biblical theology.
Yeah, there might be a higher relevance factor there for me than for others.
I was going to say that. Exactly. And you do have to have a little bit of the investment for it to be deep, right? To understand the relationships between the characters.
I would categorically say that the X-Men movies have a more of a depth than the Marvel universe, and so I tend to gravitate towards those. But I think the Disney Marvel, but although I do think that WandaVision may be sort of breaking that trend, so we'll see how that goes.
It's going to be interesting because I think J.J. Abrams, I wouldn't say tries, but he does like to make movies that seem to have more depth, but don't explore all of it, right? So they might have like medium depth, but low clarity. That would be a good example, because The Force Awakens, it did have some complex storylines that are opened up, but they're not ever answered. So it doesn't achieve full depth the way that we might look at a movie like Memento and be like, oh my God, that's like a as deep as they go, right? Like this guy is purposely deceiving himself. because he wants to feel vindication for his wife
Mm-hmm.
leaving him. So he, it's deep. We could talk about it for 2 hours and we still wouldn't really explore that.
Yeah, another movie we both seen together, First Man.
That's deep.
Is another one. Silence is another one. Martin Scorsese. And yeah, you could have different levels of depth, story, character, performance, whatever it might be.
And I'm trying to mostly stick to ones that do have a variety of attributes that are
kind of
deep.
a broader.
Yeah. So I think The Godfather, right? People are like, oh my gosh, the depth of those performances, the depth and range of the audio and the shots. Yeah. Right? So
yeah. Back to your point about the universality of it. So what about, which ones have we missed here?
I think we've explored them all to some degree.
Yeah. So let's jump in. Let's talk about the profile. So now that people understand what the variables are and a little bit of some examples, what we want to do is for people to create a profile of themselves so they know where they intersect with these variables. And then also to be able to, at least in a quick hand, be able to evaluate movies. So there's really 3 ways that people can start to build their movie shape for themselves. The first is just a profile hierarchy. Just, there's 7 movie values. There's 7 audience attributes. Just get a notepad and write down the 7 in the order that they're important to you. I care about character over performance, or visual over setting, vice versa, whatever.
And that's really where we started.
Yeah.
So, organic.
Yeah, it's take a notepad and write down, or wherever you want to do it. But you could even do just the top 3. You know what? I care most about character, performance, and story, or whatever. And that's a starting point. The second level is we have a simple and a complete profile. The simple profile is you've got the 7 attributes, and this is actually where you can create a shape. And you go in here, and between 1 and 5, you score each of the 7 attributes. You could say, you know what, relevance, I'm a 1. Or novelty, I'm a 1. Relevance, I'm a 5. Believability, I'm a 2. Depth, I'm a 3.5. Clarity, I'm a
and to be clear, there's no perfect distribution. So it doesn't have to be like there's 1 1 and 2 2s and like 1 5. You can be kind of arbitrary about it.
Yeah, as long as you stay between 1 and 5, and then the total is under 21, then you're good to go. Distribute it however you like. And this is the quick profile. And then you'll notice, I've created a quick shape here on the left. And then I'll make one, on the right here.
And the challenging thing is, if you're this is mostly going to be movie enthusiasts. So it's going to be challenging to like kill your darling sometimes, where you're like, oh, I love everything about movies.
Yeah.
It's going to be that moment where you're like, okay, I have to admit that I like these movies and they have crappy dialogue or bad visuals, and I still love them. Mm-hmm. Go ahead and drop that score a little bit, just so that we have a distinct shape.
Yeah. And one thing you might try doing is you start, everything starts as a 3. So what you could do is, pick 2 or 3 that are 1s. They don't have to stay there, but say, you know what, investment's the least importance, novelty, relevance, and then clarity, impact, believability are most important. So now you've got these kind of poles that you can kind of lean on, and then you go, well, clarity is not the most important, impact is. So I'm going to move that to 4. Believability is in the middle, so I'm going to move that to 4.5. I can move up relevance to 1.5. So you can start to shape it in different ways, and then you get down to your your score of 21. So you can work that. But this is just a quick and easy way to build a shape. It's a less sophisticated because the attributes are not overlapping, but it still gives you a starting point. It gives you a shape that you can start with, and you can do this within a few minutes. So this is the simple way. Any thoughts on that before we jump to the complete complex one?
No, in fact, I encourage people to, if they want to do all 3 exercises in order. Start by listing their attributes in that range from 1 to 7.
Yeah.
because it only takes a few seconds. And even if you're going to do the complex profile, consider doing the simple one first. Take, it goes 1 minute for the list, take 5 minutes for this simple version. And then you've got a framework so that when you get into the advanced one, you're thinking, okay, well, I already know generally where I need to end up. And then you're not splitting hairs right off the bat. You don't want to be overwhelmed. This is supposed to be useful and insightful, not confusing.
Okay. So I got buttons all over the website. It just says Movie Shapes Assessment Prototype. You just click that. It's going to take you to the spreadsheet. It's a Google Doc. Just hit File, make a copy, rename it with your name. And then you can see down there at the bottom, we got a few different tabs. We've got the simple profile and then the complete. We also allow you to have a friend's profile in here if you want to. And then we got a profile comparison. So you can compare yourself like me and Addison have. And then I've got a complete movie profile tab in there, and then a log if you want to use that. But let's jump into the complete profile. The couple, essentially what you want to do is there are 49 attributes, 7, movie values, 7 audience attributes, and then they overlay in a matrix. And we've got 7. And you can see that they tally up on the ends, the bottom, and then the right. And then the total is, you want to keep the number under 147. And then at, would I say under? Yeah, I guess at. So keep it at 147. And then you want to keep these between 1 and 5. And like I mentioned in the other one, because there's so many, pick 5 that are like your top ones. You're like, you know what? Character impact is high for me. Visual impact, performance, depth is big. Setting, novelty is big. Pick your 5s, then do your 1s. Do about 5 1s. And again, this acts as your polls to give you a starting point. Okay, now you have something to compare with and start walking through this. Really, you're going to look through this the lens of least important to most important. 1 is least important, 5 is most important, and then you can do any fractional amount between those. A couple tips that we can run through. Like I said, look at one thing that helped me is to go through it in a column. Okay, for character, what were the things that are important? And then I would go through it, and then I did story, and then I did setting, and then I did dialogue, and I went on and on. And then I did it the other way, relevance, and then I went across, novelty, went across, and I just kept refining it by looking at it that way. Like Addison mentioned earlier, pick your favorite movie moments or movies and think about what is it about them that you like.
Another thing that's important.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say is not just what you like, but what they do best will help you, because sometimes you'll realize, oh, I like a movie that's weak in other areas. So
yeah. So look at the tallies. So look at your, for clarity, you're at, or let's say novelty, we're at 21 here, and impact, we're at 23. Does that feel right that you like impact more than novelty? If not, then look at the numbers and reevaluate it. Feel free to, compare. Like one thing I would do is I would go, okay, if I'm not at 47, so let me do like 4 here. So I'm at 148. Like, man, I need to get rid of a point. So setting and dialogue, what if are those really the same? So I might compare 2 cross variables, go, you know what? I can get 2.5 out of that one, and then 2.25 out of this one. And you can kind of start to knock out a little bit at a time. Feel free to do your profile and then come back and revisit it, refine it. Down, if you scroll down after you've been making it, let me do a couple more changes here. 2.5. All right. You'll see that you have your shape down here below. So you got your audience attribute profile shape, and then your movie shape. All the changes I made is kind of showing you this. But you can actually dive into every section. So I can look at my character preferences. In this case, my character preference is a high investment. I'll actually pull up my profile so I can show you mine. So my character preferences is depth is the highest. You can see you actually have a shape for each movie value. My story preference looks like a heart. That's I didn't notice that. My setting preference, relevance, and investments seem to be the highest there. Dialogue preference, my performance preference, my visual preference, my audio, and then so you can look at the shape and go, do these shapes feel right? Do they look right? You know, it's a visual way, because sometimes when you're just looking at numbers, it's kind of hard to tell. But if I can go down here and look at the shape, it gives me another way to just evaluate it. And so this is the complete profile. If like we mentioned, if you just want to do a ranking, you can use this column and the blue column just to do a 1 through 7 ranking. That just gives you a place to do it. If you don't want to do it in a notepad, you can do it here and then come back and do the full profile later. If you hover over these columns, you know, you get a little description of each one. And then on the right here, you get the description of the rows relevance, and then you get these are the same ones that are on the website. And so that's, you know, the complete profile, and some tips on how to do that. Yeah.
I would recommend for the complete profile, the way I approached it is in like 2 30-minute sessions.
Yeah.
I sat down for like 30 minutes. My number didn't come out to exactly 147, but I felt like I was as honest as I could be with myself right off the bat. Then, this is no joke, I took some time and just watched more movies and shows. Came back and I was like, you know what? I could chip a half a point off of this.
Yeah. And that's like one thing I've been doing on my Letterboxd account. I'll do a review and then I just write the top, and we'll get to this in a minute more, but just in terms of using it for movies, what are the top movie values of this movie and the top audience preferences? And I just put that in as my review. So it just gives me a place to practice it. And figure out what it is I like. Now that would be our goal, is that the community would essentially rate movies in certain ways, like this is a high impact movie, or this is a high dialogue worthwhile movie, or this is a visual worthwhile movie. And while we may have our own shape for that movie, as a community, we would also build a shape, and that would allow people to find movies. Like I think about all the movies that I would love, but I just don't know they exist. And I feel like they are lost because I can't find them. So as a community, we have an opportunity to help share movies with each other that are based on the shapes.
Yes, and in a better way than we can do now, because like we had said at the beginning, there's always that risk that somebody's like, oh, you liked that one you know, Tom Cruise movie, so you must love Tom Cruise movies, and they're missing the more essential point of what you liked about that movie.
Yeah.
So
because a Magnolia or a Jerry Maguire or Tom Cruise is very different than, you know, War of the Worlds or Mission Impossible. You know.
Yeah. What? Those are Mission Impossible, exactly. So those are different, and people will have a easier time understanding with this tool. And hopefully we get to the point where we can leverage machine learning and AI to actually figure out the answers for us after a point. Watch our movie watching behavior, hopefully across channels. And we get something better than, you know, them just saying like, oh, people, you know, Netflix was like, people liked, what was Bird Box again? They were like, oh, people like horror movies and people like Sandra Bullock, so we're going to make a Sandra Bullock movie. And that movie hasn't stood the test of time, really. It's not everybody's favorite movie anymore. It just had that brief moment. Maybe we can get to suggesting, hey, a lot of people, there's a whole market for people who really like depth of character, and we're just not making a lot of movies like that. Maybe Netflix can pivot that way. Rather than just giving us Sandra Bullock horror.
And there's also a trust factor, like with Netflix, it recommends movies, but it's like, well, do you really know me enough to make a recommendation? Because I don't believe it. But if it was like, you know what, Jason, you like you know, depth, story, or whatever, it could look at my graph and go, you know what, there are 4 movies you haven't seen that are almost like an 80% match. You would like these. And then I've got a way to trust that, because it's not just this hidden algorithm that I don't even know what's going on. It's more of a two-way communication street. So
exactly.
anything else before we jump to rating movies?
No, that's great.
Yeah. So the next step would be, once you have your profile, now it's, rating movies. And there's a quick rating method that I've been using. I'll just pick the top 3 movie values and the top 3 audience attributes of a movie. On the website, one example is Bushwick. I watched it around when we were working on this, and I identified the top 3 movie values were visual, setting, and performance. The performance matches my value. So visual and setting are not top values for me, but performance is. And then the audience attributes impact matched, and then it was novelty and clarity. So clarity and impact matched for me. So I enjoyed the movie. I had enough overlap that it made it enjoyable. But that would, if someone doesn't share those, if someone doesn't share any of these, then they may not like the movie at all for those reasons. So I wouldn't recommend it to them, and they shouldn't recommend it to me. But if it does have it, so if I come across somebody whose movie profile, their top 3 is visual, setting, performance, and then their top 3 audience attributes is impact, novelty, clarity, like this movie was made for them. So I would recommend it. And so it's not always going to be that perfect, but the movie itself got like a 5.2 score on IMDb. Based on that, I may not have watched it, but if I saw the values was enough of a match, then I would have.
Fantastic. And so, what I think is great about the movie rating piece is that it gives us a different lens to watch a movie through. So sometimes what can be challenging is we watch a movie and we don't like it and we don't know why. But here's a weird thing, is that what if you could enjoy movies that you'd otherwise not enjoy? What if you could put on the lens of, okay, I'm watching this movie and it's strong in visual and setting. I'm going to watch as a visual and setting audience member. I felt like I had that experience for Tenet. I was watching Tenet and we said we were going to rate it. And I was rating it as we were watching and kind of being an observer. And I realized that there were some things that I didn't enjoy about the film, but I was able to say, okay, well, where is this film strong? What is the movie value?
Yeah.
And how can I study that more? How can I put more weight on that? And it helped me open up as an audience member a little bit. I got more enjoyment from the film, which was to my benefit. I don't lose anything from that.
Yeah. Yeah. So just, again, you can do it like I showed. I'm doing this in Letterbox, just writing, top 3 for each. You can follow me there. But also just, you could write it down, and if you use Evernote or somewhere else, if you prefer to do that, but just have a place where you just start to do it. There is on the spreadsheet, there is a quick movie log. So you can just write the movie name and then the top 3 values and audience attributes if you want to use that as a log instead. That's the quick way to do it. If you want to do a full profile, like the complete profile of yourself, you can also do one for a movie as well. Obviously, that might take you 30 or 60 minutes, so it's a lot of time to invest. But if it's like your favorite movie, or you're writing a review about it, that might be worthwhile to understand it. Or if you're writing an article and you want to dive into some aspects of it, that's a way to do that. There is a little bit of a difference on the audience attributes. Just the way I frame it is, when you're doing when you're doing your profile, it's the importance is the scale. How important is it, high or low? But when you're doing a movie, it's about worthwhileness. So how worthwhile is this element of the movie? The character investment is worthwhile. The visual investment is worthwhile, 1 to 5. So it's a little bit different framing, but the idea is to frame them both in a way that makes logical sense to how you look at a movie or how you profile yourself.
That's important. It's important to mention that. Stick there for a second, because it is not just a qualitative scoring of the film. You're getting a shape of the film, which means that we're going to pretend that 2 movies with a similar shape, one is better than the other, but they still form the same shape. And that's kind of an arbitrary designation that we make, because there's tons of systems that already exist to say The Godfather is better than, Transformers 2.
Yeah.
We don't need another system for that, but we could say Cool. What do these movies actually have as their strong and weak suits? What is worthwhile or not for the film?
Yeah. And you could create a shape and then also not like the film, or you could create the shape and like the film. So the liking, it doesn't necessarily determine it. You could also create the shape and then rate it from like one to 5 stars. Yeah, I think on Rotten Tomatoes 1 to 5, Letterboxd 1 to 5, and IMDb is 1 to 10. But you can rate it, like it, and then shape it. And then if you do all 3, then you should have a good idea of kind of that. You have a more complete view of that movie than simply thumbs up or thumbs down. And that's a big part of it. So anything else you would add before we wrap up here?
No, this is fantastic.
So just to kind of overlay, you can see here, Addison's shapes, my shape on the website at movieshapes.com. And it's got all the information, links, resources. You can see our shapes, compare them with each other, see where we're different, where we're similar, what our top 7 cross attributes are. Addison's top 3 is dialogue clarity, dialogue impact, and dialogue believability. And then mine is character depth, character impact, and story depth. And so you can see that we got a few links to Letterboxd, Scener. We've been using Scener to do virtual movie watching, real good for tracking TV shows, a couple articles, and then we'd love to have your feedback. So we've got a contact form. You just fill out your name and your email, and then share your feedback on how to make movie shapes better. And we'd love to get that and hear what you have to say. If you have a movie shape you want to share it with us, send it on over.
Excellent.
We got links to me and Addison's social channels if you want to check those out. Websites, you can follow those. And any final words before we finish?
No, I hope that this helps people enjoy movies more, and it certainly has helped me appreciate I think other movie viewers. Instead of thinking, are they insane or are they watching a different movie, or their eyes broken, I think like, wow, there's a lot more that I could try as a movie watcher.
Yeah. So cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Again, check out Movie Shapes, a better way to find, review, and share movies you love or don't. Movieshapes.com. And we'll see you next time.